I want to talk about the Bosnian War, my memories of the Bosnian War, and I just want to testify really to God's grace that He kept me through it all to have you three wonderful children. And it's a tale of God's grace, really. When the former Yugoslavia broke up, it was like the Soviet Union in this country, like Latvia was part of the Soviet Union, and it was the same in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was made up of Croatia, Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia, Slovenia, so forth. And when it broke up, everybody sort of wanted to be independent, but the Serbs who were living in the area that's known as Bosnia, they of course wanted to be independent and be with Serbia, just like Latvia wanted to be independent and not with Russia and so forth. But Russians who lived in Latvia may have thought somewhat differently, and so it was with the Serbs who lived in Bosnia. And so there was this war that broke out, terrible conflict, because all the people were living next to each other. Like in our block of flats, they had blocks of flats like that over there, and there was Serbs and Bosnians living next door to each other as neighbours, and suddenly everyone was against each other on sort of ethnic lines. So there was this great conflict. And why did I go down there? Well, I went down there to preach the gospel, and of course to try to help people as far as I could. There were reports of the first concentration camps that had been seen in Europe since the Second World War. It was a very bitter conflict. And well, the first time I went down there, I simply put advertisements in the newspapers. And one of the funny things about war is that life goes on sort of normally. And I want to testify to some of the wonderful things that happened. One of the early people I baptised there was a brother who's dead now called Lambe. And him and I did a lot of travelling around together in very difficult circumstances. Before I come to talk about Lambe, I want to testify to God's grace to me near Banja Luka, which is a flashpoint of the conflict. It's all full of mountains there, very steep mountains of twisty, windy roads. And I had a red van that I was driving, that I slept in at night, and going around visiting contacts, trying to take bits and pieces of welfare to some of the contacts that I'd had from the adverts I put out in the newspapers. And I got stuck behind a convoy of armoured cars that were trundling up this windy road in the mountains. And I kept trying to overtake them, but I couldn't. And I was in a very bad mood. Now, as I often say, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. This is the principle that God works by, that when we're weak, then we become strong. That He uses us when we are at our weak point, and He loves us when we're weak. That often when you are without spiritual strength, God will do something to save you, to show you that actually I love you. It's not that, oh, you're being naughty, so I'm not going to deal with you. And so God says, well, that's Duncan's problem, he can just be killed. It's actually when you're weak that He then shows you His strength, His love, His grace. That's what grace is, undeserved favour. We don't deserve it. Well, there I was, behind these armoured vehicles, and I was so frustrated I couldn't overtake. And I was in a foul mood. You shouldn't be getting bad moods, but I was in a bad mood. I suppose I was tired or whatever, but that's no excuse, as I often say. Being tired is no excuse for being cranky. And I was cranky anyway. And eventually I put the brakes on. I thought, I'd be blowed with these guys. And I just stopped. And I thought, well, I just kind of calm myself down a bit, because I just wound up I couldn't overtake these guys, which is stupid. But anyway, I thought I'd better just stop. I'm getting in such a foul mood. So I stopped. And I guess I stopped 5 or 10 minutes. And then I started up, and of course I could drive quite fast. And then I saw these guys sort of in the a little bit in the round a couple of bends, and I thought, okay, yeah, I'm going to get stuck behind them. And I was just coming up behind them when there was an ambush. And a lot of shooting, bang, explosion. And the vehicle that was travelling in the front of the convoy had hit landmines, and there were men shooting. The guys trying to get out of the vehicles or whatever. There's bullets flying everywhere. And I banged the brakes on. I did a 3-point turn on this mountain road.
It's a 3-point turn.
It's when you stop and you can't turn around in one go. You've got to go a little way, then you've got to go back, and then do it again. So that's what I did. So I just shot back as fast as I could, back down the mountain towards Banja Luka. Now, of course, if I had overtaken them, I wouldn't be here today. I would have been the one who hit the mine and got hit in the ambush. But God, by His grace, preserved me so that I would get through that, meet Mummy, and have you lovely children. But that's all of God's grace, because I was in such a foul mood that, you know, if I were God, I'd have said, look, Duncan, I give you every breath you take, every heartbeat that you take, my friend, I give to you. I keep you alive, every breath you take. So you want to be cranky and all the rest of it? Well, okay, I'll just turn away from you for a little bit and leave you to your own luck and your own device, mate. But He didn't, and He preserved me. The sad thing was that around the time that happened, there was an aid convoy being driven into Sarajevo.
What's aid convoy?
Aid convoys like where you've got trucks that have got aid in them, like food and water and clothing, and the convoy is a group of vehicles, and they travel together in wartime for safety. And the very fine brother and sister, Alan and Christine Whitcutt, were driving one of those lorries from Scotland, and a sniper shot at Christine and killed her. And
Who's
Alan,
Christine?
this sister, is Brother Alan's wife, and Alan came to a Careling's conference in the UK and testified to his issues with forgiveness and gave us a talk about it. And the funny thing was, he just seemed such a lovely guy, lovely brother, beautiful man, beautiful guy. And he said, oh, my wife was a very spiritual woman, much more spiritual than me. And I thought, well, you're a saint, mate, you know, you're a saint. If you say your wife was more saintly than you, she must have been a wonderful woman. And they were from the Edinburgh Ecclesia, and there I was, cranky as Duncan the Crank, and God saved me, by grace. For all I know, Alan and Christine were probably singing psalms, and there I was, cussing under my breath and being a bad guy. And God saved me, by grace, but she got the bullet. And, you know, it's to make you understand that God is very gracious, very gracious. And going on from Banja Luka, I said about my friend Lambie, who I baptised. He was the first guy I baptised in that part of the world. And Lambie was, him and I were true brothers in arms, true friends. Just two memories. One, again, in Banja Luka. We got in there, and as I say, the funny thing about war is that life sort of goes on. The first thing you want to do, well, I wanted to do, was to find the local newspaper and put an advert in the newspaper. There was no internet. There was no cell phones. There were no computers. The only news you got was on the radio or on the newspaper. So if you wanted to advertise the gospel, you really had to go on newspaper adverts. So we got there and bought some newspapers and looked at where the editorial office was. And we went there, and this office was a fairly imposing building with steps going up to it. In those days, newspapers were fairly powerful things, and the editor of a newspaper was a very powerful person because he could influence the readers. So there had these steps going up to it. We walked up the steps, and there were litter bins, metal sort of bins, quite ornate sort of bins on the steps, just a couple of them. So we walked up these steps, and we walked in and said, "Where's the advertising manager?" They said, "Well, the editor is the advertising manager as well." Whatever. So we went to see this guy and gave him an advert saying, you can write off a free Bible and for help and for turn to God, etc. and my details. I paid the guy the money and shook hands with him, and we chatted a little bit about how the war was going, and he said, there's a lot of people trying to assassinate me, trying to kill me, because of whatever his particular political opinion was, and stuff that he published in his newspaper. And he was a bit rushed. He said, "Look, I'm leaving. I've got to go out of the office soon, quick. I'll just deal with you now. Can you come back?" And I said, "Well, we can't come back. We're just passing through." "Okay." He said, "Look, I'm leaving now." Okay. Well, Lambie and I left his office and shook hands with him, and we were walking down these stairs, and my car was parked around the corner. And Lambie, like a lot of people in the former Yugoslavia, was a chain smoker. He smoked all the time. But I didn't let him smoke in my car. So he said, just let me have a cigarette. So we stood by the one of these bins.
Smoke bins?
No, it wasn't a smoke bin, it was a...
Ordinary bin?
Yeah, it was a bin like where you could put rubbish.
Like in the banks?
No, just a bin, like a garbage bin.
Oh, like our England, the big black ones?
No, not a big black one, a little bit smaller than that, but made of metal. So anyway, we stood by this bin and he smoked a cigarette. And he threw the cigarette into the bin, sort of stubbed it out and threw it in the bin, and he said, "Oh, let me have another one." I said, "No, mate, let's get going." He said, "Oh, go on." I said, "No, let's go." "All right," he said. So I didn't let him have a second cigarette. We walked down the stairs, and I just turned round and saw the editor was coming out behind us. Anyway, we got to the bottom of the stairs, and I remember we turned left. We were walking down the stairs, got to the street, and we turned left, and we started walking. Bang! In that bin by which we had been smoking, by which Lambie had been smoking, and where he threw his pretty well only half extinguished cigarette, there was a bomb. And that bomb, the people were obviously watching, they were expecting the editor to come down the steps. That bomb was let off by somebody. And in one of my old Bibles, I used to have some cuttings from a newspaper where there were pictures of the editor.
Why were people trying to kill the editor?
Well, because he was a powerful man. In those days, newspapers were powerful because they influenced what people thought. And anyway, there's a picture of him in a wheelchair because the bomb did explode and blew his legs off. And I guess he was lucky he wasn't killed. If I'd let Lambie have a second cigarette, as he desperately wanted to, we would have been standing right there. And as I said, that one cigarette he did have, I just have when the trauma like this happens, you remember every moment of it, I can tell you, every second. And I remember that cigarette being, him not completely stubbing it out. And in that, and I remember the bin looked like it it was full, like someone had stuffed a load of stuff in it. Well, yeah, there was a bomb stuffed in it. And
they looked at every bin. Is there being stuck or not stuck? Is there been stuck that they can hide it so nobody can see it?
that's right. That's what they did. They put it in there and made it look like, well, it's like a bag of rubbish or something. And they were obviously watching. Somebody pulled something or detonated that in some way. And as I say, in war, life goes on in a funny, very funny
And
sort
at
of
the
way.
end of the war, in the city, it leaves a mess.
It does leave a mess. And anyway, what I'm saying is that if we'd have stayed there another 60 seconds, 2 minutes, definitely I wouldn't be here, because the two of us, Lambie and I, were standing next to the bin. And I noticed that looks like it's got a load of rubbish in it. Someone's put a packet of rubbish in here. So, you know, you just think, there's the hand of God. If he'd have had a second cigarette, and if I hadn't have said, no, come on, let's go, well, I wouldn't be here, and you lovely children wouldn't be here. So that's the hand of God. Absolutely the hand of God. And while I'm talking about Lambie, who was one of the most finest brethren that I had the privilege to baptise and to work with, and I salute you, Lambie. And you'll meet him in the kingdom of God.
Did he die?
He died.
When?
He died of cancer a few years ago. And it was some years later. It was, well, the whole way I met Lambie was again by, well, the hand of God. I mean, I was driving actually someplace else. And in those days I used to always carry leaflets with me, little leaflets. And I stopped in this little town to, I don't know what I stopped for, and I literally handed out, well, I didn't hand out, there was all the letterboxes for this street in one big sort of batch of letterboxes like we have here in Latvia in the villages. Like the whole village, the letterboxes for the villages, for the like village houses are in one place. And I saw this and I don't know, I just got my little yellow leaflets and put one in each box. And that's how he came. But anyway, it was all the hand of God, and it's going to be in the kingdom now. And all that. Yeah, it was later, some years later, after the Bosnian War itself had finished. It was during the American-British NATO bombardment of Serbia, when they disagreed with Serbia over their president. They wanted a regime change. They disagreed with Serbia over their treatment of people in Kosovo. And him and I were going to baptise a man who's also now dead, a brother. And the news came on that the Americans were, or the NATO, it wasn't just America, it was NATO, were bombing Novi Sad, and the situation in Novi Sad was really, really bad. And he said, but Novi Sad is where my sister lives with her kids, my little nephew and niece, and we have to, like, can we go to Novi Sad and get her out of there if it's so awful like they're saying on the radio? I said, yeah, okay. So we drove to Novi Sad, and we drove through the night, and we got fairly near and came round some sort of bend, and you could see the city. And talk about apocalyptic images, that is, the sort of scary pictures you see in books, in Bibles that are children's Bibles, maybe describing the destruction of Sodom, or the picture in the pictures in the books of Revelation, the fall of Babylon. It was night, and like Novi Sad is all big tower blocks, high tower blocks about the size of our tower block or even taller. And there were flames, massive flames going right up into the sky, huge flames, and they were like silhouetting these tower blocks.
And we once looked at photos of that.
That's right.
And but you said it was even better.
Yeah.
They just took photos in the morning.
We came around this kind of corner and we saw this sight. And it's like, but my sister is in there and her kids. And it really looked like a nuclear bomb had been dropped. And we were like madly listening to the radio like
a nuclear bomb? Two nuclear bombs?
And I was thinking, he said, oh, that's a nuclear bomb. I said, no, surely NATO, they don't drop a nuclear bomb. For sure. But it looked absolutely awful. It looked like the entire city was burning from where we saw it. These massive flames. And, well, in those moments you feel anger, and I felt ashamed to be anything to do with the West, that they can do that, you know. Of course, the other side does it just as bad or worse, I understand, but just the view of it as we saw it looked like, man, Novi Sad is finished on everybody that lived in that. It's a city, it's not a town, it's a city, that this place is finished. And, well, we prayed, but you think like, well, there's no point praying for a miracle when in front of your own eyes, this place has been absolutely bombed and exploded to pieces. And I remember thinking, there's no use praying for a miracle. Well, as we know, the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit aren't around today, but it is true to say that God still does great things. And very often, when you're up in a hard situation, it is partly a matter of perception. That is, it's a matter of how you look at it. And he said, well, you're going to keep driving, right? He didn't drive. And I said, well, yeah, keep driving into that, but, well, why not? And actually, there was a petrol station. And as I say, the funny thing is in war that life kind of goes on. Well, we pulled into this petrol station and actually bought a coffee. Can you believe it? And I said to the fella who was in the petrol station, what? Novi Sad. He said, oh yeah, pretty bad. And he explained to us what had happened, that they had hit there's a big oil refinery in Novi Sad. They had hit the oil refinery, that is big, huge drums of oil. And all that had exploded, and there were these massive flames from the oil refinery that had been hit by their bombing. And sure, from where we were standing, it looked like the whole city was on fire. That's what it looked like. But actually not so. Actually they hadn't touched the city, they hadn't actually bombed the city. They had they had hit this oil refinery and it had exploded, and it was pretty dramatic. So
the idea was to catch the whole city, right?
No, I don't think that wasn't their idea. Their idea was to destroy the oil refinery, and that's what they did. And so sometimes when people say, oh, I've seen these amazing miracles or something happen, well, that's something to bear in mind that I think might not be per se a miracle, but it is that we had one particular perception. We imagined that something was the case because it looked the case, and actually it wasn't. But all the same, when we understood that, it felt different, and did feel very, very grateful to God. So, we live in a world where young people particularly waste their lives looking at screens, and their dreams and their aspirations are to, I don't know, have the ultimate phone or the ultimate whatever device, and to have, I don't know, this experience or that experience. It's all rubbish. If you really give yourself to living for Jesus, if you really give yourself to serving God and Jesus, for one thing, as a young person, you'll have a way more interesting life than, say, the kids I grew up with. Way more interesting life. That's not why you do it, to have an interesting life. But when you put your little hand in God's, He will hold that hand and He will use you. And the greatest thing is if out of all that you can save just one. Well, I believe the work we did there, although not huge numbers were baptised, a lot of those who were baptised are now dead and they died in faith, and I look forward for sure to seeing them in the resurrection. That's the greatest thing you can do. And that's why as you then approach middle age, old age, death itself, you realise that, wow, I look forward to seeing those people. Lambe, Yvonne was another brother down there who's dead now. And yeah, not everyone holds on, people lose their faith and so on, but all I'm saying, out of it all, some do hold on, and this is the greatest hope. That's the greatest thing you can do for anybody. So, I thank God and I testify to God that He saved a wretch like me and saved a fellow like me from all that to have you wonderful children. And I thank God for that. And just hope and pray that as a family we can give God all the glory that's due to His name and to the Lord Jesus.